Homework 6, section 3.4, Logical Arguments, video 10. As I mentioned in the last video, there's a way to think about all of these argument forms in terms of words, as opposed to just a mishmash of P's and Q's and symbols. I take that back. The symbols will remain intact. All the conditionals, all the disjunctions, and even the negations. But you can describe all of these in words. So what I would like to do in this video is go through each argument form and replace the letters with something a little bit more descriptive. For example, in every conditional, I'm going to replace P and Q with what they represent: antecedent, antecedent, A-N-T-E-C-E-D-E-N-T, and consequent. But as I do that, I'm going to make these same changes down here. For example, in the law of detachment, where the letter P was, I just replaced it with the word antecedent. So I'm going to replace this P with the word antecedent. And where the word consequent was the letter Q. So I'm going to replace this letter Q with the word consequent. And what we get is the law of detachment in words instead of symbols. If your first premise is an antecedent pointing to a consequent, and your second premise is the antecedent, then you can validly conclude the consequent. If we do the same thing for the law of contraposition, I'm going to change each P to the word antecedent. Antecedent. I never leave enough room to write that. And down here I have negation of antecedent, and I could leave the negation symbol, but I think I'm going to actually write the phrase negation of the antecedent. And the same thing with the Q. I'm going to replace it with the word consequent, but the second premise is the negation of Q, so I'm going to replace that with negation of the consequent. And now we have a word version of the law of contraposition. Law of contraposition says, if your first premise is an antecedent pointing to the consequent, and your second premise is the negation of the consequent, then you can validly conclude the negation of the antecedent. For the law of syllogism, it gets a little bit more congested because, and I just erased it, but the first consequent is the antecedent on this, the consequent of the first conditional is the antecedent of the second conditional. So how would I write the law of syllogisms in words? I would say antecedent, I can never spell that right the first time. Antecedent pointing to the first consequent. And then your second premise is the first consequent pointing to a second consequent. C-O-N-S-E-Q-U-E-N-T. And the conclusion that you would draw is another conditional, the antecedent pointing to the second consequent. So if you have one conditional and a second conditional, and the end of the first conditional matches the beginning of the second conditional, then you can fuse them together into one conditional and cut out the guy in the middle. For the law of disjunctive syllogism, we can't use the words antecedent or consequent because there is no conditional. So what we can say for the disjunction is statement 1, disjunction, statement 2. Give me 1 second to get my lids on the markers. And then for the second premise, we can say the negation of one statement. Doesn't matter which one it is. And for the conclusion, we can conclude the other statement. So if we have a disjunction and we know that one half of it is negated, then we can conclude the other half. For the fallacies, we can pretty much do the same thing. For the fallacy the inverse, if I replace P with antecedent, then I can replace negation P with negation of antecedent. And if I replace Q with consequent, because that's what it originally was, then I can replace negation Q with negation of consequent. And now you can focus more on the structure of the argument and not who's P and who's Q. For the fallacy of the converse, if I have antecedent replacing the letter P, then it would replace it down here. Hey, I spelled it correctly. Pointing to the consequent in the first premise, then I would change this Q to the word consequent. Then we have a description of the fallacy of the converse. If you have an antecedent pointing to a consequent as the first premise, and the consequent is your second premise, then concluding the antecedent is a fallacy, and you can't do that. And then for the fallacy of the inclusive or, just like the law of disjunctive syllogism, we can generically represent the disjunction as statement 1, disjunction, statement 2. And then for the second premise, we can say either statement and the invalid conclusion being drawn is the negation of the other statement. You won't have to memorize these. I will give you every one of these, both in symbols as in the previous video and in words as in the what you see right now. Sorry folks, I just want to make sure that the homework doesn't kick me out for being inactive. I bet that's happened to y'all. All right, so we're going to take a look in the next video at an example of a homework question that asks you, using a valid argument form, first off, which form is it? And then is the argument valid or invalid? I'm sure that YouTube auto captions have a great time translating when I fumble my words like that.